Well, we'll stop here. And so now let's go to the slideshow. So, in fact, there were two strikes that Griffith was responding to in weaving together his account. They were both strikes against the Rockefeller-owned corporations. The first was a strike in Ludlow, Colorado. A group of miners who worked for the Rockefeller family went on strike. They were evicted from their homes, which were all owned by the company in the mining district of Colorado. They set up a tent and they continued to strike. This was in 1913, 1914. Rockefeller sent in his company militia, and the governor sent in National Guard members to disperse the strikers. The strikers were at the mining grounds, but they went to the tent city and they set it on fire and raked it with machine gun fire. Approximately 20 to 25 people died. It's not clear exactly how many, 11 of whom were children. So it was the families that were punished. These are photographs from the beginning of the strike. And then, as was often the case in a U.S. labor strife, quickly the situation became militarized, with either the company or the government or the two of them working together, sending in armed groups to try to take charge of the situation. And machine guns were a normal part of life in labor strife. And this was, in fact, an armored car that brought in a bevy of machine guns into the strike situation. Something that we don't normally think of. And so the newspapers around the country reported this. This was the tent encampment after the massacre, the Ludlow massacre. These photos were a real shocker to the country as a whole. They knew that labor strife strikes were generally violent, could easily turn violent, but they had never really seen pictures, including in this, the picture of the funeral of the victims. The Bayonne strike started peacefully enough. And again, newspaper reporters, photographers went out to document it. The effort to bring in scabs or strikebreakers was met with violence on the part of the workers who were striking. This is a photo it's not a very good photo, but it's what exists, of a strikebreaker being beaten up, perhaps killed by the strikers, which then led to the police and the state militia coming in. Again, a great shock, and as a result of these two strikes, the Congress held national hearings on labor strife, and particularly on the Rockefellers' approach to labor relations, and why in both these cases the strikes had quickly turned deadly. But the labor question goes back in time. Goes back, in fact, to 1877 in the United States. Of course, there were labor issues and strikes before then, but in 1877, something particular happened. But this is the kind of campaign literature that any politician would put out. So Ulysses Grant presents himself as a member of the working class because he had worked for some time, not a very long period of time, as a tanner before he went to West Point and became a military officer. And his vice presidential running mate had been a shoemaker before he became an attorney. Candidates always wanted to present themselves in their garb as working men. But they also made sure to present themselves in their garb as middle-class professionals. So there was this double image of them. The first major national strike started in July 1877 in Virginia, West Virginia, Virginia, and Maryland, when railroad workers who were employees of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad refused to handle rail traffic or to let trains pass through the town. They were protesting a 10% cut in wages that had been announced by railway executives of the major rail lines. All the major rail lines got together and collectively agreed to cut wages by 10%. So then the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad persuaded the governor of West Virginia to send in the state militia to oversee the movements of the trains. And when the troops arrived, they actually fraternized and began to show sympathy with the striking railwaymen, which was a continuous problem if you're the employer at that time. But then later in the day, a striking railman who was posted at a track switch was shot and killed. Nobody was quite sure by who, whether it was by a state militiaman or whether it was by a company guard. So word of his death spread across the Baltimore and Ohio line, and workers at every station walked off immediately. On Wednesday, Wednesday morning, the murder happened on Monday. On Wednesday morning, hundreds of workers rallied in front of the Baltimore and Ohio's offices in Baltimore. A riot started, and by the end of the day, 10 people were dead, 16 injured, and 250 arrested. Then President Rutherford B. Hayes sent in federal troops into Baltimore, and this was the first time in U.S. history that the federal army had been used to intervene in a labor dispute. This escalated the situation and galvanized railway workers all across the country. And by the end of the week, pretty much all railroad traffic across the country had stopped. And the railroad workers were not going to allow any trains to move until the 10% pay cut was rescinded. And one of the interesting things about this is wherever the railroad workers went on strike, townspeople across the country joined them to demonstrate their support, partly support for friends and neighbors, but also their opposition to the still new corporations that had come to dominate the post-Civil War economy. So people looked at railroads. They didn't just see transportation, they saw this revolution in the economy, the managerial capitalism taking over and appearing to have the power to overwhelm everything in its opposition, change the way in which people were living, but also have the power and the money to control the government, which was supposed to be the voice of the people, but was now being viewed as an instrument of the managerial capitalists. Protests turned violent in Buffalo, New York City, in Reading, Harrisburg, Altoona, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco. There was considerable destruction of property. The most dangerous situation developed in Pittsburgh, where by the end of the week, railroad workers had occupied the center of town, and the state militia was sent in to restore train service. Local guardsmen refused the orders they were given to disperse the strikers. The governor then sent in militia from other parts of the state, and which then led the mayor and the city council to protest the invasion and occupation of their city. So this was no longer being viewed or even discussed as simply a struggle between railroad workers and railroad companies. It had become a question of how democracies function. On the Saturday, the railroad executives then paid for more troops to be sent in. Troops were brought in from other states, and the railroad companies also paid for private militias to come in and help the Pennsylvania National Guard take back control of the railroad lines. When the first train began to move, huge crowds blocked its movement. Troops fired into the demonstration, killing 20 people and wounding 7. Then, as word of the massacre spread, the city of Pittsburgh just shut down completely. Workers and shopkeepers flooded into the streets and started physically attacking the militia, often with guns. The militia retreated, and for several hours there was no law and order in Pittsburgh of any kind. And stores that belonged to corporations and offices that were associated with the new corporation were looted and set on fire. And by the morning of Monday morning of the second week, much of the area surrounding the train depot was in ashes. Now, they did have photography, but the film was too slow to take pictures of events that were happening on the spot. So magazines would send out artists to capture the events. So the scope of the protests had already spread across the country, but they grew violent.